I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, and today my video is kind of sort of a resume to kind of show some of my credentials on the games that I've seen fit to collect, some of which I've played and read and sought to understand to kind of broaden my knowledge of gaming rules. Or because in my past I've played some of these games and have a strong attachment to them. I have what I would consider to be a play library, meaning that any of the books that I have aren't collected just for the sake of collecting. They're there because sometime down the road I would very much like to play most of them, or have played several of them. And a couple of them, it's just waiting for the right opportunity. So I thought I would start out by going with one of the oldest games that I own. And this might not be too terribly much of a surprise, but a lot of us older gamers who have been collecting for a long time start our collections with Dungeons and Dragons. In this case, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Of course, I have not started out with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but I acknowledge it is quite an older game, and it's one on which the backs of this game and others that came out at this time, many of the other games that we play today, are standing directly on. Now, I recognize that there are older games, especially Dungeons and Dragons, the original, which I have in PDF form. I have the first, I believe, 6 books for that, which I have never played or run, but I have them and I've kind of looked them over. This I have played a little. I'll admit I haven't played a ton of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but I am currently running a campaign, a short campaign, a dungeon that is basically a campaign right now. I'm running WG9, a module called Castle Greyhawk. Kind of a joke adventure, but I'm getting to use the skills that I have to run games and playing this old school role-playing game. So, I have, of course, the Player's Handbook, classic. I have a couple copies of this because I have a play copy, and that's kind of my better quality, more finished copy. Some of the play copies can get a little bit rough. Of course, along with that, I have to have my Dungeon Master's Guide, and this, of course, is quite a bit thicker for all the rules, charts, and tables in the game. The basic Player's Handbook didn't have a great deal of rules, and almost everything in it was basically built around your characters, creating characters, their powers, leveling, and then spells and effects. This is everything from your treasure tables, combat matrices, and remember, your player characters back then didn't have access to things like your saving throw tables or to hit tables. That was kept up by the Dungeon Master. So, got that. That was an important one. And of course, the third of the triad, the Monster Manual. Another classic here. Great art, over 350 monsters. These are your core monsters that you would be using again and again and again in the game. Now, in addition to that, of course, we get other books and supplements to flesh it out. Most game masters will want more monsters, new wrinkles to throw at your players from time to time. And for that, I have the Fiend Folio, which has some of the weirdest monsters. I think right now we're in the 40th year anniversary, or perhaps it was last year. But this has a lot of really strange monsters. You could tell that they really let their imaginations go with the Fiend Folio and some of the expanded books. We also have the Monster Manual 2, which also, again, added quite a few monsters onto the growing pile. Again, some strange ones, but ones that have continued on through all the various editions, like the Varghoul, Magmans, all kinds of fun creatures, Tracholisks, some nasty ones too. But again, a wide range of creatures to challenge players at all levels. Also, to expand what else we can do with the game, the Wilderness Survival Guide, which basically took you out of the dungeon. The original Dungeons & Dragons was basically the assumption that you would form your party and you would go into a dungeon. And when you were done adventuring, you would try to get out of the dungeon, and upon getting out of the dungeon, you would leave, rest up, heal, and probably go back into a dungeon. If not the dungeon you just left, then another dungeon to try your luck, because that's really what the game was about. Going into these dungeons and trying to kill the monsters and take the treasure. More of a take the treasure, because that's where you got your experience more so than combat. But it was more of a test on, did we have enough supplies to make it in? Can we make sure that we have a safe escape route? Things like that determine whether or not your party would get wiped out or they did well. So on top of the Wilderness Survival Guide, which again allowed you to explore the great outdoors, which could lead to more dangerous encounters, as suddenly size is an issue. If you're down underground, your chances of finding a dragon may not be so great because they need a lot of space. In a wilderness encounter, a dragon could go flying overhead, and now you have a dragon around. If it sees your party, you may have to deal with that. Also, the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide, which provided extra gear, rules for surviving and adventuring underground. So this was a supplement for add-on rules to kind of expand what you can do with the game, to kind of give guidance to the dungeon master on how to run encounters underground, and gave a lot of really good ideas. I don't think it was as useful as the Wilderness Guide, but, you know, one of these days we'll probably do a full review on these books too. Of course, you might look outward beyond the normal fantasy world that you were in, and for that we had the Manual of the Planes, which allowed you to go into realms outside of what is familiar with trees and grass and sky above you. Some of the outer planes you couldn't always expect that was going to be the reality that you were going to walk through, and some of them are very strange or frightening realities. So this was a good game because I always loved the odd, the unusual, and shaking my party out of their comfort zone. In addition, I also had what I consider to be some of the absolute seminal supplements. These are ones that really serve to continue fleshing out the game, and that was Unearthed Arcana, which gave you a lot of new magic. It gave you new class ideas like the Cavalier. Just a lot of really good add-on stuff. Although you may want to really look into any of the new stuff and see if it jibes with how you want to run your adventure. Some of the things could, taken in a certain way, can not quite break the game, because in D&D at least, you can always find creatures that can challenge just about anybody. But it can really make some players far more powerful than the ones around them. So you kind of had to watch out for that. We also had Oriental Adventures, which allowed you to play samurais and ninjas. Interestingly enough, monks were a part of the original Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So they were more of your Shaolin mystical ascetic monks with martial arts abilities. It probably would have fit better in something themed around what we consider to be fantastical, historical, Oriental cultures. But combining elements of Chinese, Japanese, that whole area, kind of got a bad name because the expression Oriental is kind of frowned upon these days. But this was another book for those who liked that culture. And back in the 80s, there was an awful lot of ninjas and things. If you remember even G.I. Joe, they shoehorned a ninja, Snake Eyes, into it. And the bad guys had to have a ninja, Storm Shadow. So, yeah, you had that. But, it was popular enough to get into your Dungeons & Dragons too. So one of the very first campaigns I ever played in first edition, we had a samurai and we had a ninja in the group. 2 ninjas, actually. So that was certainly an interesting expansion too. I'm not as much of a huge fan, but I got the book so that if anybody else is ever interested in those classes, we would have those rules to look at and consider, to give as much opportunities for choices for players when we go back to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The other 3 books that I have, I think, are ones that are situationally useful. Deities and Demigods. I'm not a big fan of letting characters meet up with the gods. Especially back in the days when you statted the gods, you practically begged the players to go hunting them. Especially when they had incredibly powerful magical items that the players coveted. So they could go out in their party, do what they felt they had to do, and try to contest against the very gods. And I would occasionally hear somebody who would boast that they and their party went out and they slew a pantheon, and now their character is running around with Mjolnir and Gungnir and so on and so forth. So I wasn't a huge fan of statting out the various deities. And no, that is not the deities and demigods. If you've know anything about the history of Dungeons and Dragons, the very first printing, they actually took a few licenses on verbal agreements that they had, and they included the Michael Moorcock mythos with Elric of Melniboné from the Stormbringer story series, and they also included the Lovecraftian mythos with Cthulhu and the other gods. Those fetch a pretty penny right now, and I'm not paying that much for the book, but they were cool. And I don't have that version, but I do have a version which covers an awful lot of ground, including a lot of things that are practically forgotten about these days, especially some of the less popular cultures in modern, our modern consciousness. And then, of course, I have 2 that are themed towards particular AD&D campaigns. I have Greyhawk Adventures, which, combined with the Greyhawk box set, Greyhawk Jewel of the Fleneas, gives you a lot of really useful things, from characters to monsters that are unique to this world, to magical items and some spells that allow you to tailor your campaign that takes place in Greyhawk, or something with similarities to Greyhawk, admittedly. You can parts this out and resource it to anything you wish, but you can run adventures in Greyhawk and tailor them, giving them their unique flair for that campaign. Likewise, I have the Dragonlance Adventures book. Same concept. It's got the gods of the Dragonlance world. It has most of the notable characters from Chronicles, which of course is what really launched Dragonlance into the common knowledge. Now, of course, Weiss and Hickman wrote lots of things, and other people have written into the Dragonlance universe as well, I believe. And that's not going to incorporate all of that. But it does cover the Chronicles quite well, and the adventure path that takes place and tells the story of Chronicles, which was released, having this around really can make that handy. In addition, it had the rules for playing Kender and Tinker Gnomes and Krynnish Minotaurs, which I've had people interested in. Not so much about the Kender. Not terribly much about the Gully Dwarves either. Seems people don't like those kind of handicaps or that kind of prejudice, as Kender are seen with not a lot of patience for some people. But by having those, I kind of get an idea of what I value in my role-playing game collection. It's all of the stuff that lets you have a wide range of access to a lot of different options, mostly around the players and the choices that they can make for their characters and what they want to play in that world. Now, of course, that isn't going to be all of the modules that I have. Those are something different, and perhaps we'll cover those if there's anybody interested in them. But this is the bedrock of my collection for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. There aren't a lot of other books that came out for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that I really long for. Because this is the majority of their mechanical rule books, the supplements that added on to their rules and expanded. The next thing that was available really was their their Dragon periodical, their magazine, of which I have the first 250 copies on CD. And that is kind of how they pitched new rules. Somewhat in the same way that the Unearthed Arcana of the modern Dungeons & Dragons does the same thing. It would cycle out new ideas, and a lot of people would just grab onto that as the new canon, the new rule set. So certainly some really interesting ideas, and it was cool to watch the evolution of the game. But this is what I chose to collect now. The game is long dead. Not in the sense that nobody plays it, just that it's not being expanded on anymore. It has gotten all the rules for it that are going to come out, except for people who are going to, of course, keep the retro clones out and similar games, and then they can tinker on and add to it, but it won't be Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So, that is my AD&D credentials. And we'll be covering those books, the advantages, disadvantages of them, the strengths and weaknesses, and what we can pull out for our games. And, if you want to bump any of those up in the priority list, feel free to leave in the comments, and we will definitely address those first, whatever people are interested in. But in my mind, those are the greatest books that they came out with for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which is why I was not collecting books back when these were in circulation, so I went back and I bought all of these because, quite frankly, I was too young. I will, however, in my next collection video, show you the very first role-playing book I ever owned, because that is where I got my start in role-playing games, which is a little game called Dungeons & Dragons, which was the Beck-Me Basic Expert Companion Master Immortal set. So, thank you for joining me. Hopefully this kind of got you curious about some of this. If you're not very familiar with these books, if you'd like an overview, refresher for those of you who once were used to them and haven't seen them in a while, I'll gladly reintroduce you. So, until that time, thanks for joining me. I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, and I will see you next time for another session. Thanks, and farewell.